Pleasure having you.
I'm not going to be doing a technology startup. Turning on the mic is about as hard as it gets for me. The second thing that's going to be a major challenge for me is staying on the stool for an hour, okay? That's not going to be good because this doesn't look the most comfortable. The only reason David managed to talk me into do this is when he showed me the video, there were big, cozy, grey chairs. And I was like, yeah, I can go and sit on one of those for an hour. But now he's put me on this. I mean, what's that about? But when you work globally, you have to be flexible because you have to be prepared to adapt and work in different cultures and work in different environments. And I guess the other thing you have to do is you have to know when to cut and run. So I've worked in about 42 countries since 1989. Now, you could say that means I'm in quite a lot of demand. On the other hand, it could be that I know when to get out before they get onto me. Over that period of time, as David sort of said, KPMG is a global professional services firm, three main arms to it: accounting, tax, and advisory. I'm going to come out and say I'm not an auditor, I'm not an accountant. Okay, I'm in the advisory part of the business, which is, in my view, much more the interesting side of the business. We don't just count the numbers, we actually try and do something with them. We try and make sense out of them, and we try and actually think about how you can actually use data to inform business decisions, whether that be in the private sector or in the public sector. So as an organization, we have about 160,000 people, not 20,000. What was that? What was that about?
I have no idea.
We have 20,000 in the US. We have about 160,000 people around the world in 156 countries, based in 156 countries, but working in many more. And our business is kind of split. We work with the public sector, but we also work with the private sector. I've spent most of my career working in the public sector, and most of that actually working as an advisor to various governments around the world. And that ranges from South America, places like Guyana, through the Caribbean, places like Jamaica, Grenada, Turks and Caicos, through to South Africa, India, Bangladesh, Russia, most of sub-Saharan Africa, and the Balkans. So, you know, quite a wide array of different environments. One of the common features with all of it has been working very often in post-conflict environments. And that's been something that I've done a lot of in probably the last 20 years. And post-conflict environments are kind of unique because you've had a war, you've had a civil war, you've had a disaster of some type, and you're actually trying to rebuild. And that's probably the most difficult sort of environment to operate in because, you know, if you're an investor, and many of you, I suspect, when you finish here are thinking of setting up your own businesses, clearly one of the key things that you want is stability and predictability in the market. You know, you don't want to be in an environment where there is physical danger to you and your staff. That's not a very good precursor for business. So anyway, that's just a bit of background.
So can you talk to us a little bit about the mega trends that you've been seeing and KPMG has been identifying as things that matter in terms of creating this stability and moving the economy forward?
Okay, we did a piece of work about, I guess, 2 years ago, looking, it was designed to inform the debate around the Sustainable Development Goals. Can I just ask, do you know what the Sustainable Development Goals are?
Someone who does.
Okay, there's one person who does, that's good. I'm glad to hear it. Okay, the Sustainable Development Goals are being developed by governments all around the world under the auspices of the UN to replace what are currently the Millennium Development Goals. So this is really about how do we get the world's population out of poverty? What are we going to do about that? How do we kickstart economic growth? How do we improve equality? And how do we do this in a way which is sustainable? So we conducted some research recently to feed into that process, because one of the things that concerned us is a lot of the debate was set around this is where we are, and assumptions were being made about what the world was going to be like in 2030. So we wanted to do a bit of research to actually have a look at what we thought was going on. And we kind of identified a number of things that we called megatrends. There's a whole bunch of trends out there, but we tried to identify which ones we thought were likely to be the most significant for governments, but also for private sector. So I'll just run through a few of them and just talk to you about them. So the first one is demographics. You've probably all heard about this, but the world population by 2030 is estimated to have grown to 9 billion people. Okay, but there's some significant differences within that from a country-by-country basis. If you look at somewhere like the US, the population is aging, and up to 35% of the population will be over 65 by 2030. Now that has implications about your market, about healthcare costs, about the ability to actually engage with the population and think about the sort of services that you want to provide to them. In other countries, the picture is almost the reverse. If you look at Africa, over 60% of the population in Africa will be under 25 by 2030. So you've got two totally different demographics and two totally different markets. You can imagine the sort of goods and services that maybe you want to buy at your age are going to be kind of a bit different, you know, than somebody in their 60s want to buy. So you need to think about that from a market point of view. The second thing that's happening, and the demographic has got a whole series of implications around about it in terms of how you pay for health costs, the amount of GDP you need to actually allocate to cover, you know, social services and benefits and social safety nets and all that kind of stuff. And that's a real challenge for governments. It looks like the amount that we are going to be spending maintaining the population aged over 65 globally is going to go from about 1% of GDP to nearly 2.5%. So it's going to more than double. You're talking huge sums of money globally there. And that money, obviously, if it's being spent on that, can't be spent on something else. The second thing that's kind of going alongside that is the increasing sort of trend towards middle class in these countries, yeah. So you've got a population which is rising dramatically in terms of numbers, with much of that growth concentrated in Africa and Asia, and a population which is becoming increasingly middle class. If you look back to 2009, 27% of the world's population were middle class, and the bulk of those people were in the US and Europe, yeah? By 2030, 60% of the world's population will be middle class. And 80% of those people will be in what are now developing countries. So just think about what that means in terms of the sort of global market that you're looking at. You think about where that buying power is, yeah? So you've got, if you look at then Africa and Asia, what you've got is a young population, a growing population of Africa likely to go from about 1.1 billion today to about 1.8 billion by 2030. Massive growth, and people moving out of poverty and into sort of middle class sort of status. Now, what does that mean? Well, it means more demand for energy. It means more demand for water, more demand for consumer goods, yeah? So it's putting much greater stress on the resources, but it's also creating opportunities. These are new consumers. These are consumers who want goods. They're markets that need to be addressed, yeah? So the third of the sort of what we would call the sort of individual factors to do with people is enabling technology, the impact of technology. And I don't think you need me to tell you really about technology and how that's moved over the last decade and how it's likely to pick up. But that has significant implications for business, both in terms of your product cycle, the life cycle of a product, how long it takes to actually get your development to market, and then really what's the life cycle of that product, while the period during which you could recoup your investment, yeah? That period has got shorter and shorter and shorter over the last 20 years, yeah? But allied with that has been a change in the longevity of companies as well. If you look back to the sort of 1930s, if a company got onto the Standard & Poor's list in 1937, it could expect to be on that list for 75 years. Yeah? It could expect to be on that list for 75 years. By 2010, that had dropped to 15 years. All the projections we're seeing at the moment suggest by 2030, it will be 5 years. So what you're going to see is a rapid churn of companies and a rapid churn of products. So that has implications in terms of how you actually set up, how you recover your investment, the sorts of things you can invest in, how you operate them. So moving on from there, we then talk about the sort of enabling environment. And sort of 3 factors that I would kind of run together, and I'll just pick up there really. One is globalization, the increase of the global economy and the increase of global trade. Yeah? At the moment, about 40% of GDP is generated by global trade. By 2030, that's likely to be 65%. So that means it's going to be inter-regional trading. So the sort of thing you've seen in the US a lot, where US companies have moved their manufacturing offshore, you're going to see a lot more of that. Whether that be from the US out, from Europe out, or from Asia out, as people are moving around. So you're seeing a lot more movement of trade. You're seeing a lot more interconnectedness in terms of the manufacturing process, and that has implications in terms of how you ethically manage your supply chain and the pressure that's put on companies to actually think about how they do that. But associated with all that, the other major change that's going on is the center of economic gravity is moving east. So you've got much greater connectivity between companies, but you're also seeing that by 2030, nearly 40% of all global trade will be generated in a circle that really covers South Asia and Southeast Asia. Yeah. That area will also cover about 5 billion of the world's 9 billion population. So if you're thinking about markets, there's a damn big one there. But you then step back and look at that from a government perspective. One of the big problems is trade, interregional and global trade. 80% of all trade agreements were negotiated before 1990. So they're already 24 years old. And many of them are irrelevant because they cover approaches, technologies, markets that frankly didn't exist. They're trying to deal with markets and products which didn't exist back then. So you need to think about how you actually restructure that global trade environment. And particularly, I mean, if you look at Africa, for example, Africa only has about 4% of global trade, yeah? Which is minuscule when you look at the size of the population and you also look at the size of the country. Yeah? I mean, if you take the US, China, Europe, you could fit all of them into the land area of Africa with room left over. You know, I mean, it is an enormous continent. It is only just starting to access its raw materials and its resources. And therefore, there is going to be a massive boom in Africa over the next 20 years as countries start to bring their oil, their gas, their mineral resources on stream. Yeah? And that, again, is going to create opportunities. There's a problem with that, though, because much of that extractive-led growth is not job creating. So it pushes up your GDP, but it doesn't create a large number of jobs for the unemployed or for the youth because they don't have the skill sets to actually fit into those jobs. So there's an issue there. And if you talk about scale, and you just think about scale, yeah, India alone, in order to absorb the young people coming into the job market, yeah, over the next 20 years, India alone needs to create 1 million jobs a month. Just think about that number, and think about that when you're talking to the guy from the Michigan Development Agency next time.
Yeah, Michigan Economic Development Corporation.
Ask him how he would create 1 million jobs a month and how big a challenge that is. Yeah? I mean, that's pretty huge, yeah? You're not going to get that level of growth from big established companies. You're going to get that growth from entrepreneurial development. You're going to get it from SMEs. It's the SMEs that create the bulk of the new jobs. And all the evidence, if you look at the US over the since the 1980s, the net gain in jobs in the US has all been generated by SMEs. Yeah?
SMEs are small to medium
enterprises.
Yeah.
Okay. Sorry.
That's right.
Okay. Now, alongside all of that, there is another factor, and that's public debt. Okay? So governments have got an increasing number of demands that they're faced with, from an aging population in terms of educating a larger pool of young people, in terms of thinking about different market dynamics, in terms of thinking about how they attract investment that will create jobs, create growth, create wealth in their countries. But global debt is currently at about 80% of global GDP. Okay? And you all know, just from financing your studies at university, there's a limit to how much debt you can stand. Eventually, people say, hey, we're not going to lend you anymore, you know? We think you've got enough. So debt ceilings are a challenge for many countries. They're thinking about, okay, if you look at Africa, for example, there's a shortfall of investment in power in Africa. About 70 billion a year is needed. In terms of Africa, about 80% of the people in Africa have no access to electricity. I mean, frankly, if you're going to invest and set up a business, are you going to do that where there's not clean water, where there's no electricity? How are you going to run your operation? You need certain basics in order to make these things work. So there's pressure on the governments to actually invest in basic infrastructure. That comes at a price. The size of the global population, the growth in the global population, the increasing number of that population which are falling into the middle class, means that over the next 20 years, power demand around the world is going to go up about 50% from where it is today. And bear in mind, 80% of the people in Africa at the moment don't have any access to power anyway. So just think about that for a minute, the massive growth. Now, at the same time, the pressure is on to do that sustainably, because if you look at the way China has grown, China has actually used coal, what people would call dirty power, with all the environmental impacts of that. So the pressure is on to meet that demand for additional power using sustainable resources, so thinking about how you can do that much more cleanly. So there's a whole series of opportunities growing up there in the market around that. And then just picking up the last group, which are really about the broader environment. There's climate change, which I don't think any of you guys need me to say anything about that. You know, there's tremendous body of evidence that suggests that there is going to be a shortfall over the next 20 years of about 40% globally in terms of water. Various areas of the world which are actually currently productive, particularly in Africa and Asia, are drying out. And agricultural yields are decreasing at a time when the population is increasing and the people are becoming more affluent and are demanding more consumer goods and more food. So there's a massive shortfall there. And in terms of water, again, the shortfall is likely to be about 40% of a global shortfall of about 40% in water. Yeah? So all of those sorts of issues are placing resource stresses on governments, and they're pressures that governments have to deal with. Now, alongside that is increased urbanization. So we're seeing an increasing trend with more and more of the world population actually living in cities. And if you look ahead about 15 years, you'll see about 440 cities in the world will generate nearly 50% of the global GDP. So you're going to have massive concentrations. From a government perspective, that presents obviously opportunity in terms of tax base, in terms of concentration of service, but it also presents challenge in terms of infrastructure and in terms of the people that are still living in the rural areas. So what are you going to do about spreading your growth and spreading your wealth across your country? Are you going to have some sort of regional development strategy, and how are you going to deal with that? So there's a whole series of challenges there which governments around the world are actually facing and are thinking about. That's as a summary anyway.
So one of the questions that was put out to each of you was, what do you think, other than the United States, is the most entrepreneurial country? And we saw some of that coming off a tag board. Does anyone want to share some of the examples that they gave? Looking for volunteers. Yep.
China and Germany.
Anybody else? Yeah. Australia.
South Korea.
South Korea. Anyone else?
Nigeria.
Nigeria. Israel.
Can I also just add like Brazil to that as a developing nation with a lot of
Brazil. Wow, there's a lot of diversity there. Can you tell us a little bit what the statistics are saying globally at the moment about the entrepreneurial hotspots and what that might look like as these trends continue to develop over the next few years?
I have to say, I'm never totally sure. I've got a number of colleagues who work with me who are economists, and they'll probably not thank me for saying this, but if you've ever looked at an economist's graph, they're always trend-based. So if stuff's going like that, the assumption is it will continue going like that. If stuff's going like that, the assumption is it will continue to go like that. You'll never see an economist's graph that goes like that when they're predicting forward. It's always either continuing down or continuing up, so they're almost always wrong. So, sorry, John. So I think I would treat a lot of the sort of statistics in this area with a certain degree of skepticism, but a recent OECD study looking at this sort of said the top 4 countries in terms of sort of entrepreneurial environment were New Zealand, Australia, Canada, and the US. Yeah. The US kind of not getting top spot because regulation and tax regime mainly. But it's interesting, if you were to go out and sort of say to people, where would you want to set up a business? I suspect the US would be pretty high on the list of most people.
But do you see that changing over time based on some of the statistics and megatrends that you're talking about?
Well, it all depends on countries' ability to change and to grasp the opportunity. And there are sort of 2 aspects to that for most countries. There's a threat and an opportunity. So if you look at, say, a country like India, you've got a change in the cyclone pattern. So India has traditionally had 2 monsoons a year, big one and a small one. And that's critical because it enables them to grow 2 crops a year. So you've got a population that's massively increasing. And recently, there have been issues in terms of whether the 2 monsoons have been happening. Same in the Horn of Africa. I mean, the major famine that sort of took place in the Horn recently was as a result of the second rains failing. And that has clear implications in terms of agriculture and in terms of the population. So the governments around the world are actually trying to cope with a number of different factors. The sort of 9 megatrends that I mentioned, they're putting pressure on them in terms of dealing with their citizens, creating employment, trying to create a business environment, thinking about how they respond both to the challenges but also to the threats. And they're trying to balance their budgets while doing that. Or in most cases, they're not trying to balance their budgets. They're trying to borrow a reasonable amount.
So if you're a student today and you're studying at, say, the University of Michigan, and you're thinking about starting a company, what 2 or 3 factors are you most keenly aware of in light of some of these global environmental things?
Okay, I think the first thing really is be absolutely clear about what you want to do and why you want to do it, and do it early while you can potentially afford to fail, because 50% of all new startups do fail in their first 5 years, and very often it's the second or third attempt that kind of works. So be prepared to do it. I would say don't necessarily follow trends, but look to create them. I mean, if you look at the market opportunities out there, they're absolutely tremendous. But I mean, if you're thinking about operating in a market outside the US, you need to really think about the risk-reward equation and how you're going to manage that. What's your access to capital going to be? Where are you going to access it? What sort of exchange is it going to be? Some markets around the world look attractive, but the big issue is that you can't repatriate your profits. Now, I don't know about you guys, but if I'm investing somewhere, I want to be able to take my profits home at the end of the day. I don't want to leave them in somewhere else. So you need to think about how you can actually manage that. There's political stability as well. I mean, there have been a number of countries that I've worked in around the world that have actually undergone major political problems. Return to civil war, nationalization of various products and assets. And clearly that's an issue, depending on the market you're actually thinking of investing in. But I mean, I think access to capital, having an idea, either having a novel idea or a novel way of implementing the idea, and being prepared really to stick with it for a period of time. Many of the things, I've seen a number of companies that have actually gone into markets overseas and they've bailed too soon, and they've sold the business to a local organization, and that organization's been successful. And mainly it's to do with understanding the culture and thinking about how you need to adapt what you're doing to the local market.
So let's open it up to some questions for you. Because we've been talking to investors and entrepreneurs and developers of products on the first half of the class that are fundamentally there's implications for the broader marketplace outside of the United States, but they're starting here. Now we're talking about a little bit more environmental factors. Can I open it up and just get a few questions from you? What are you thinking about in respect to this? Anyone? Yep.
Not just the business you're bringing in. So how do you deal with the non-intrusive process of building a business there? Do you deal with cultural advisors that are local, or how does that
Okay.
work?
So to restate the question, it's just really about the cultural and environmental factors locally if you're coming in externally, right?
I'd like to say there's one answer that you can apply everywhere, but I've seen different approaches in different markets that have worked to differing degrees. It really depends as well what sort of product, what it is you're doing, what industry you're in as well, because there's quite a lot of it is industry specific. So if you look at one end and you look at the some of the capital intensive industries such as extractives, oil and gas manufacturing, they have very clear processes that you're following, and therefore yes, you adapt them to local culture, and you're looking at putting in place a sort of a license to operate with the local community. But you have very clear processes you need to follow. I think if you're looking at one of the things that you need to deal with if you're working in a different country is, there is a very different regulatory environment, and you need to think about how you manage that. I've seen a lot of companies go into countries and kind of assume it's the same as it is at home. You need to get really good advice about the market. You need to understand exactly what's going on. Just things like actually registering the business. If you look at things like the World Bank Doing Business survey, the differences around the world are quite enormous in terms of, the number of processes you need to go through, the number of stages, how long it takes to do that. One of the big issues that I've come across quite a lot has been the whole issue of property. And that is really very significant in quite a number of countries. A lot of countries in Africa and in Asia, property rights are not clear at all, particularly for women. And you need to be really careful about how you actually operate in that environment and what you're trying to do. There are some countries where the land rights, I was talking to someone in our Congo office recently, and he was saying to me that one of the big issues they've got in the economy is, one, land rights are not at all clear. There's just no idea who owns a particular piece of land. And secondly, the economy is all informal. So people don't want to register their businesses because if they register them, they pay tax. So they would much rather not do so. But as a Western organization, if you're going in there, clearly you need to act responsibly and ethically. So you can't just go in and kind of camp out on a piece of ground and set up your business. So yes, you can adapt to the local environment, but sometimes you can't. You have to actually stick to an ethical standard which is appropriate.
Yeah, right here.
So world, we're consuming most of the energy and resources right now. What are some of the things that we are going to have to expect in our lifetimes to shift in order to maybe balance things out?
Yeah.
So the question is about sort of how do we all work together in light of these trends, and particularly because the West is consuming more at the moment, and that could be changing. How do we make this all work?
Yeah. There's a lot of work going on at the moment around what I referred to earlier, the Sustainable Development Goals, and there are very significant elements within those goals and targets that relate to sustainability, to energy use, to water, to the various sort of environmental factors, and thinking about how you manage them. So that's one aspect of it. So governments actually need to think about how they're interrelating with others, and they need to think about the sort of treaty-based obligations, whether that be the UN or the World Bank or whatever, which are treaty-based organizations. There's a clear need for reform of those institutions to actually make them more appropriate and more relevant to the sort of challenge that we face at the moment. So that's the one side, is the sort of institutional side. The second side is actually thinking about really arrangements and agreements between countries, whether it be trade agreements and opening markets, you know, reducing protectionism so that you can access technology. But associated with that are some real challenges, because if you look at, if you think about opening markets, one of the issues is intellectual property. And you've probably seen there's been a lot in the newspapers recently about India, where there's been major disputes between pharmaceutical companies in the US and in Europe and Indian companies who are actually who are producing pharmaceuticals. There's issues about whether there's licensing and intellectual property, whether they're actually producing those products at a low cost, whether they're paying appropriate licenses. So there's an issue about how you get that sort of overall regulatory regime set. And then obviously there's the issue of citizens, really. So there's an issue about, you know, how are you going to consume, really? What are your consumption patterns going to be? A big issue is around investors, you know, pension funds, trust funds, all that sort of thing. You know, are you prepared to invest in things that are going to give you a potentially lower return if they operate in a socially responsible and ethical way? There's no guarantee you would get a lower return, but there has been some evidence that in some markets that is the case. Would you actually not go into some markets? Oh, let me ask you a question the other way around. What would you say is the fastest growing market in the world at the moment? Which country had the fastest GDP growth last year? Everybody gets the computers out and starts looking for the answers. No.
Right. India? Anyone else? China? Anyone else?
Well, let me ask you, before I give you the answer, let me ask you something. Do you think it would be a good idea to invest in the fastest growing economy in the world? Does anybody think it wouldn't be? Does anybody think it would be? Okay. Mass indifference. Okay. Militant indifference. Okay. Well, the fastest growing economy in the world last year was South Sudan, 35.3% GDP growth. Are you all going to pack up and go and set up your businesses there? I don't think so. So it's not just about GDP growth. There's a whole series of other things that underpin it, about the society, about the culture, about the environment, that you need to take into account. And you know, it's difficult to do, because if you think of it from a government's perspective, I mean, South Africa, I was in South Africa last year doing some work with the government there, and they've just put out their new national development plan. So they called it Vision 2030. And they're thinking about, you know, what's South Africa going to be in 2030? What sort of country do we want to be? And how are we going to achieve it? And there's a sort of implementation plan to get there. But there's some massive challenges along the way, and there's some assumptions. And one of the big assumptions is that you're able to treble the size of foreign direct investment into your country. And the issue then is, how do you do that? And that's the challenge for government, really, is to actually think about, you know, what's your policy? What are the things you want to do? What are the sectors you want to encourage and invest in? What are the sort of ethical policies and approaches that you want to put in place? What sort of tax regime are you prepared to put in place, and what sort of tax breaks, whether that be corporate or individual taxes? What are you going to do about investments and amortization of investments, and how you're going to actually set those up? And then how are you going to balance the demands? Because I mentioned earlier about, you know, the cities, the sort of 440 cities around the world. Those are going to generate about half of the world's GDP. But they need massive investment in infrastructure, in power, transport, communications, water, etc. So there's a challenge for governments. You have to invest in order to reap the rewards from that. How are you going to do that? And how are you going to prioritize it? And are you going to allow growth to be led by the private sector and focus on those areas where the private sector wants to operate? Or are you going to try and spread that growth across your countries and actually manage it? And if you do that, there's a risk. And particularly if you look at somewhere like Africa, where you've got a continent which is split into 54 countries. Some of those countries are landlocked. There's issues about how you actually manage the trade agreements, how you manage access, and then what you can do in terms of attracting investment into those countries.
If you're looking to start a business in a different country, what are some resources you use to find out about regulatory environments, cultural, and other resources?
Okay. Well, one good source is the World Bank. They publish something called Doing Business Index, which they do every year, which is basically assessment of the sort of rules, regulations, and the processes that you have to follow in order to set up, establish, and regulate a business. The secondly is obviously get good professional advice from people who actually understand that marketplace. And I'm not here to do a plug for my own company, but we do a lot of that sort of work, so do all our competitors.
Is there any projection about how mobility in the tech industry is going to change the incentive and the regulation framework?
Question about mobility and technology and how it might change the regulatory environment globally.
I've not really, I've not seen anything. Well, I've seen a few bits and pieces, but I've not seen anything really very detailed on that. No, I haven't. I haven't seen anything. I could give you my personal view, but it's based on nothing other than my personal view. So, I mean, I think, I mean, every country wants to have a Silicon Valley. I mean, while I was living in India, one of the big focuses for them was how can we move to get a big slice of the IT industry, and they invested very heavily in Bhubaneswar and Hyderabad, and basically went out and said, right, we're going to build all these facilities, and we're going to go out and we're going to court American companies so that they can have a 24/7 operation. Yeah. A number of other countries, once they saw how successful that was, tried to follow it, and they've not been that successful at it. So, you know, there's an issue about how you grow that market. You find, if you look at what's happened in China, a lot of it started off with American and other products being sent out there for manufacturing, technological products, but now they're actually manufacturing their own products, which they're designing and developing in market. India is now the same, so is Korea, Japan. So I think there's going to be a much greater spread of manufacturing of technology. There's already tremendous innovation coming up in Asia, and I think that's likely to happen in Africa as well over the next 20 years.
A question over here.
Getting back to the resources, I had some experience with the British consulate where they would help you find cities to locate and hook you up with people. Do many countries have that similar type of a service where they're sort of recruiting companies and they might help even small companies?
Yeah, I mean, most governments will have a trade and investment arm. It's usually co-located in their embassy. And it depends on the country, really, how well funded that is. Most of them will tend to focus on a limited number of sectors because you need specialists to engage. I mean, quite a lot of the African countries are focusing on extractives at the moment. I was at the Rwandan embassy recently and talking to the Minister of Trade there, and they're very focused on how they can actually get more extractives into the country, so that they see that as a major building block to actually generating growth. But yeah, I mean, most of the embassies have that. The other things that quite a lot of countries actually have as well is regional development agencies. They generally don't have a profile in the overseas mission, but you can certainly look those up online. And they're quite a good resource as well.
Got a question in the center.
Yeah, you talked a lot about statistics and projections for 2013 about how the population.
2030.
2030, sorry, about the drought and whatnot. Does that scare you at all about how the amount of resources needed is going to increase and the production will decrease or kind of stay the same?
Yeah, I think it's a major challenge, and it's a challenge for governments really all over the world. You know, you're looking at the impact of sort of droughts and floods and earthquakes, typhoons, and whatever, and the impacts, the negative impacts they'll have on your economy, which can blow you off course and you know, really damage your country. So yes, I mean it is a major challenge, but the interesting part about it is it's also a major opportunity, because it's an opportunity to think about developing and deploying new technologies to actually deal with some of those issues. You know, if you're looking at a 50% increase in power, the easy way, demand for power, the easy way to do that is as Africa opens up its coal mines and they come on stream, you use coal-fired power stations in Africa. But from an environmental point of view, there are issues with that. So maybe you need to think about how you can actually use clean technology to do that. So it's an opportunity. Water is another example. I mean, you know, over 50% of all water that's actually pumped out of a reservoir is lost before it gets to your house. You know, the bulk of water that's actually, you know, if you take what's lost and what's used for agriculture, that's about 90% of water that's produced. So if you can make agricultural usage for irrigation more efficient, and you can look at reducing the system loss through using technology to actually improve the transmission of water, you could actually tackle that sort of problem. So they're not insurmountable problems, but they're problems that actually demand technological solutions and a willingness to actually engage and invest to actually solve them. So I see them as opportunities rather than threats. It's about, that's out there, what are we going to do about it, and just think about how you can set up a business to deal with it.
So one last question, right here.
So you mentioned that part of your job involves giving recommendations. There is some recommendations to the U.S. government on how to gain that top spot. What would they be?
Listen, I'm here on a visa, and I want to stay here for another 2 years. I want to stay here for another 2 years. So, but talking hypothetically, if you look at it, you say, well, what have been the issues? I mean, and why has it lost top spot? If you look at the sort of OECD survey, and you say, well, why were New Zealand, Australia, and Canada rated higher? It was to do with business regulation, ease of actually setting up, establishing, and operating a business, and tax regime, corporation tax. So I mean, those were the two things. So you can either address other areas to increase them to offset for your relative weaknesses, or you can tackle your weaknesses. And different countries do that in different ways. There may be cultural reasons why they can't change. I mean, if you look at India as an example, yeah, India's got a population of 1.2 billion people, yeah. How many people do you think pay income tax in India? Out of 1.2 billion people, 33 million. So, you know, I mean, does that give you a strong tax base on which to invest? You know, so if I was looking if I was the Indian government and I was looking at what to do, I wouldn't be looking to increase taxes. I'd be looking to broaden collection and improve collection efficiency. So there's more than one sort of solution to an issue. So you need to actually look at it. You need to understand the data. You understand what it means, and then think about how you can deal with it. By contrast to that, South Africa, 57% of government revenue comes from taxation, from income tax. So that, you know, total differences. It gives you much greater predictability about revenue. It has issues about how you can actually fund your investments and your borrowing, because you've got that sort of predictability. Yeah.
Thank you, Trevor Davies. Michigan, let's thank you.
The key takeaway here, and this is really important for entrepreneurs, who you are at 25 doesn't define who you are for the rest of your life. At 25,